Dear ladies and gentlemen, now we turn to our second panel of the morning, Coded Canvas, exploring the transformative role of artificial intelligence in creativity. This conversation will examine how AI is shaping new artistic mediums, the questions it raises around copyright and consent, and its role as both collaborator and competitor in the cultural landscape. And to moderate this discussion, we're pleased to welcome Walter Pace, art and technology entrepreneur. I come from art and archaeology background, with a background spanning media, mixed reality, and Web3. Walter previously led commercial strategy at the New York Times in the Middle East and Africa, co-founded Iconospace in Amsterdam to develop mixed reality tools for the cultural sector, and in 2019 launched Monsolo in London, delivering innovative projects across digital media, new media, and community engagement. His work includes public and private installations across the US, Europe, and the GCC. Please join me in welcoming Walter Pace, who will guide today's conversation and introduce his panelists.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As Yelena says, my name is Walter Pace. It's a privilege to be joining you here in beautiful Doha to moderate this discussion. Artificial intelligence is rapidly becoming not just a tool, but a cultural force. With it, we are witnessing in real time a reshaping of how images, music, text, performance are made and shared. It's lowered barriers to creativity, while also unsettling our ideas of authorship, labor, and originality. For some artists, it's a collaborator. For others now, a direct competitor, and even an extractor of their style and work history without consent. So the question is no longer simply what can AI make, but what kind of cultural landscape is it making around us? Who gets credited? Who benefits? Who becomes training data? And who's left out of the story completely? To unpack these tensions, I'm joined by two cultural leaders who've been thinking about these questions in real time, through the lived reality of institutions working with artists at the frontier of new media. Joining me is a man who really needs no introduction, but I'm going to give you one anyway. Hans Ulrich Obrist, Artistic Director of the Serpentine in London, and one of the most influential curators working today. Known affectionately as the curator who never sleeps, he organized his first exhibition in his kitchen at 23 and has since curated over 350 shows worldwide. He's also the creator of the Serpentine Marathon series, which has become one of the key global forums for new ideas in art and technology. Through both his long-running interview project and his institutional work, he's helped shape the contemporary dialogue between art, ecology, and emerging technologies, including AI as a cultural practice. Thank you for joining us, Hans. Joining him is my second guest, Alex Poots, the founding artistic director of The Shed in New York, arguably one of the most innovative cultural institutions of the past decade. Born in Scotland with a background in both music, performing arts, and later visual art, he's produced landmark projects with artists across disciplines, from experimental performance to large-scale public commissions. Before launching The Shed, he founded the Manchester International Festival, redefining what a festival could commission and stage. Moving across the pond, he also served as founding artistic director of the Park Avenue Armory. Through his visionary work, he's helped reimagine what a 21st century art institution can be. Agile, interdisciplinary, and deeply responsive to new creative technologies and inventive practices. In conversation, these two bring the perspectives of two institutions, London Serpentine and New York Shed, that have been redefining how culture meets technology on both sides of the Atlantic. Please join me in warmly welcoming them. Now, before we start, I was honestly hoping we'd have a few more people because it'll make this vote more meaningful. But I'd like to take the pulse of the room on this topic. As artificial intelligence moves ever more boldly into the realm of art, how do we all feel about it? I'm going to give you two simple statements, one reflecting caution about AI in the arts, and the other reflecting optimism about its potential. Please listen first, and then I'll ask for a show of hands. Okay, first the cautious statement. AI currently represents a real threat to artists' livelihoods and the authenticity of human-made art. And then the optimistic statement. AI represents a new mode of cultural production and one the art world will happily adapt to. Okay, now a quick show of hands for those who feel closer to the cautious view. Okay. And now the optimistic view. Excellent. I think the ayes have it. Thank you. So at the heart of this is a simple question. Is AI just another tool that artists use? Or has it become a creative partner, shaping the work with them? If it's only a tool, then we're in familiar territory. But if it's a partner, then authorship and originality start to look very different. Hans, when you look at this moment in AI, do you see it as just this next step in artists using new tools, as when photography or sampling emerged? Or do you think it's a much bigger break from everything before? What's the parallel that works for you here? And what's the part that doesn't map?
Thank you for this question. Yeah, I think if we look back, I always remember a conversation with Namjoon Paik when he told me that he actually started to work with robots, in the 1960s, and he thought that art can somehow be not only an answer to that, but art can have a presentiment at the forefront of that. So I think the idea of involving artists in that seems important. Of course, in the 1960s, there was also the initiative of Billy Kluwer, who, with Robert Whitman, did the EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology. And for me, it was always clear that it was necessary to somehow connect artists to these conversations in technology today. And that is true, I think, more than ever now with AI, where art can play actually a very central role. I mean, we've just done a project, we're going to talk about that later, with Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst at the Serpentine. And that project was not only about ethically sourcing data, but it was actually very much so to kind of make the invisible visible. And Paul Klee said early on, and I think that's relevant for AI, that art can make the invisible visible. It can help us today to do that. And Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst do that by actually showing a data set and making the data set, which is usually opaque and not transparent when we use or interact with data sets, by making that transparent and making the data set into the artwork. So I would say, and then the next chapter was the exhibition closed, and all of a sudden this project is discussed both in the UK by the government and by the EU, without them even knowing that it's an artwork as a possibility how we can use AI today in a responsible way. So I do think it's important to have artists in that discussion.
Thank you. Alex, New York, how are you positioning AI work today? Are you treating it as something to potentially collect, work to commission, or more as an experimental sandbox space for the public to explore?
Thank you. The Shed actually is not a collecting organization. We're really there to explore human creativity across disciplines, from performing arts, visual arts, and popular culture, and technology. And so, when a new area of invention is appearing, as is AI, and I just to slightly add something to Hans's earlier excellent reply, although different, if we think about the birth of the technology that became known as film, it took all kinds of people to take this new format and turn it from something that at the start was used very inelegantly and very clumsily into something extremely sophisticated, which we saw starting to happen at the start of the last century. And so I think artists have always played a huge role, to support what Hans is saying, a huge role in taking new technological, scientific developments and finding ways to be creative with it. Of course, for every technological invention, or for any invention, there are negative ways forward and positive ones. And I think the show of hands are probably all correct, depending on how it's used. But I think our responsibility at the Shed is to find creative and inventive and risk-taking ways forward to support those artists who really want to find meaningful and profound ways forward with AI. I met someone earlier a few weeks ago who wanted to replace the word technology with AI because they thought AI was such a dominant force. I'm not sure I totally agree, but there are very few artists, actually, I think, who are bilingual in the practice of art and in the practice of AI. And I think because of that, we need to find ways of collaborating. And I think this is a very, very good moment and a good example when actually a single artist may not be able to command the knowledge and the understanding and the skill of both worlds. And so a place like the Shed, to answer your question, is a meeting place where great technological minds and great thinkers from other disciplines who are not seen as so-called artistic, but who are highly creative, and I would argue that they are great artists within their fields. They just work with different tools that are maybe not paint or musical notation or choreography, but they work in code and in scientific modularities. So that the Shed is a meeting place for that, and we are very lucky to both have Hans as our advisor there, and many other advisors from different disciplines. So we can adapt to any singular moment and bring in the right people to get behind an idea. And we're going to discuss some of those ideas later.
Does that way, and Hans, perhaps you can answer this afterwards in context of the slides you'll be presenting, but are you treating AI-led works differently in terms of the expected literacy of audiences? Are you explaining them differently so that audiences can understand them? Do you treat them differently to other media, or are you still sort of learning through that process?
You know, my job is always to sit with artists from the start. And as I said, if we could just use the word artists as creative humans, whichever field they're in. But my job is to sit there and listen to what they're trying to achieve. I may not understand, often don't understand the world they're coming from. I use that moment to learn, which is mainly why I'm in the job, is this endless journey of learning, which is just wonderful. But I sit and listen to them, and I provoke them with questions, to your question, about, well, what do you mean by that? How are you going to do it? Do you need people from another world to help you realize that? And the big questions I always ask is, how is this going to be perceived by the audience? How can we present this in a way that is, I would hesitate to use the word immersive because it feels like smothering people with something, but in a very interactive way. How do we generate curiosity without smothering people with too much rhetoric and too much kind of insider baseball talk? So my job along the way is to find doorways, windows for different kinds of people, different levels of experience to look in a window, maybe decide that it's interesting enough to then walk through that doorway, and to make it, make the circle that we're working in wide enough so that people from different walks of life can enter.
Great, thank you. Hans, perhaps you can consider that question in context of the slides I'd like you to present. The Serpentine has been investigating AI for over 10 years now, so you're a veteran in this space.
Yeah, it began around 12 years ago. I gave a TED talk, and after that talk, a young artist, actually John Nash, came up to me and basically said how devastating he thinks it is that institutions, only deal with technology on their website, and in most cases, not even well. And so, I'm always very curious and open. I mean, that's the principle, to be open and curious. So I said, I really want to learn more. And he said, we have a group in London of young artists. It was the beginning of blockchain, and he was telling me about all these ideas I had never heard about. So I said, the next day when we are all back in London, let's have breakfast. So I met his basically group, and among the people in this breakfast was Ben Vickers, and whom you also know, and I realized that Ben was really, a visionary with technology. He had been working as an artist a lot in education. He had brought technology into the university context. He had worked with several universities in the UK, and was just a perfect kind of moment to say, could you do that for a museum? Could we build up a tech department? And we literally, the same day, started to collaborate, and have collaborated ever since. And then basically, Ben helped us to set up this department. And it began, and that's maybe the first slide we can see, it began actually with the website, with Cecil B. Evans, who created a character called Agnes. We can have the next slide, which accompanies you basically on the website, but then soon led to kind of research projects like James Bridle, who is an author and artist, who created, again on our website, basically a system of weather prediction and connected that weather prediction model to the prediction of election cycles. And we sort of felt all of that still happened on the website. So we thought, at a certain moment, it should really enter the exhibition. It should enter the program of the exhibition space. And for that, we started to build a department. And that it goes back to, what Alex said about bringing in people, bringing in people as consultants, but also to kind of change an organization. Because I was a freelance curator, but in 2006 I joined the Serpentine and started to think, how could one invent or reinvent an institution for the 21st century? And one thing is, of course, to create new departments, a department for ecology, a department for, civic projects, and then a department for art and technology. So we built with Ben a team which goes until today and has actually grown. It's now led by actually Kay Watson, and it's 5 curators. And we started to actually produce, and that leads us to the next slide, started to produce projects with technology in-house, help artists to produce them. And one of the first moments when really AI came into the exhibition space was with Ian Chang, with Bob, Bag of Belief, where basically Ian created this participatory piece where visitors were invited to interact with this AI creature. And this is really when I realized for the first time that the artwork becomes a living organism. It's never twice the same. And your interaction with the artwork, creates a feedback loop. And we saw that from day one, because actually the first day already in the digital and analog visitor books, some people said, somebody said like all the way from Birmingham, and Bob wasn't really nice to me. And then somebody else said, I traveled from very far and I now have to take a hotel in London because I want to meet Bob again tomorrow. So, it's a very different relationship to an artwork. Day 3, I got a phone call in the middle of the night because the parks had alerted us that suddenly the gallery flared up, with the projection. I mean, it was nothing serious, it was just the projection went up because Bob decided to start at 4 a.m. instead of 10 a.m. So these are the kind of early beginnings of us experiencing, in a way, an AI work in an exhibition space. And then, of course, that also leads us to the shed because in 2018, Bob,
21.
Bob
return
then
of Bob.
came to New York.
Bob came to New York. It was called Life After Bob. And this is, it's a wholly different way of making work and presenting work. We traditionally, we go to museums and there are normally static objects on the walls, known as paintings and sculptures. The idea that an artwork would evolve through time and would be self-generating is fascinating. So what actually happened was that the piece that you had launched then came to the shed as the kind of 2.0 update of this. And really, the idea was that AI and these AI entities permitted to co-host and to cohabit in a human mind. So the idea was that there was this character called Chalice, and at birth, and this is fictional, at birth, her father had inserted AI so that from birth, her entire evolution was in counterpoint with an AI entity. What are the moral questions around that? Would, at teenage years, the child rebel against the parents or the AI, i.e. themselves? All of these questions, rather brilliantly and prophetically, Ian was exploring from really 2018 onwards. And we had the great blessing of having that piece at 2021, right around the time we also had Rafiq Anadol's piece, which I think was very early on. It was 2 years before MoMA did their first AI piece. But we've been very, very interested in this field really since the 2018 onwards. I don't know if you want to say more about Bob.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting also if you think about the fact that actually, very few people live with a video artwork at home. It can also create a whole new relationship, to actually live with such a work. Because when you wake up in the morning, the work has evolved, the work has changed. But also, it's not only in terms of, of that, but also in terms of public art, there is a huge potential in that. Because if you imagine that basically you have a public artwork like Ian's, and it's in a subway station or it's in a train station, and people go to work every day, encounter a new dimension to that work. So I think it includes a lot of potential. So that's so it's early days.
we've got a couple more slides. I'd love you to run through with my old schoolmate, Alexandra Ginsberg. Feel bad if she didn't get a mention.
You know, I'm really excited that she and you went to school together, which we found out this morning. So with Alexandra, I mean, we started to do research and also, of course, with the team, with Serpentine Arts Technology to create the future art ecosystem. The future art ecosystem basically is a report we launch every year. So the idea is also because not every museum has a tech department as we have it. So we decided with Bettina Kröger, our CEO, and myself to basically, and our teams, to really create for the sector, you know, a kind of a tool and share it all. So it's totally open source. You can download these future art ecosystem. There are 4 books so far. You can download them from the Serpentine website. And out of this research, we encountered, you know, your schoolmate, Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg, who works in a very interesting way between design, architecture, art. And she had this idea to basically do a pollinator garden. So she wanted to basically do an artwork for pollinators, not about pollinators. So it wasn't basically, you know, centered on the human visitor. It was there to be enjoyed by pollinators. And it was the biggest artwork we've ever done in Kensington Gardens, because we obviously do pavilions in Kensington Gardens, as you know, at the Serpentine every year in summer. And I'm so delighted actually 2 of our former pavilion architects are here, Rem Koolhaas and Marina Tabassum. And Marina's pavilion just came down the day before yesterday. And besides the pavilion, you know, we do these public artworks. And this was the biggest public artwork. It's a big, big garden. And I've never seen in my life more pollinators at the same time. It wasn't only bees, it was pollinators, you know, we very rarely seen otherwise in the park. And so in a way, the idea of Alexandra was also that not only would this be a public artwork, but it would be sort of not only top-down, and I think that's the case for a lot of these works with AI, but there is a strong bottom-up dimension. I know that Alex wants to talk about that later in relation to a recent project at the Shed. And that happened, you can see the website is www.pollinator.art. And there you can actually have an instruction manual that you can do your own pollinator garden, you know, with this AI system and AI advising you how to plant the plants in your own garden or wherever you want. And so I think in a way, this idea, of course, what we can see also is just also the idea how all of a sudden the collaboration between an artist, designer, and technologists can really lead to something which is both very beautiful but also very useful. It happened also at the Eden project. And then interestingly enough, also, you know, in a non-art museum, in the Natural History Museum in Berlin. And that's maybe a last point in relation to that. I think what also is important, if we want to sort of address the big questions and challenges of the 21st century, is that we sort of think about new alliances, you know, that museums don't just collaborate with other museums. That's, of course, wonderful, but that museums also collaborate with entities they would otherwise never collaborate. You know, we could, for example, collaborate with Fortnite in relation to our technology project with cars, and would have, you know, the Serpentine on the landing page of Fortnite, and all of a sudden 152 million people, you know, would encounter in 2 weeks our exhibition online, and 10,000s of teenagers would all of a sudden bring their parents to the exhibition space, you know, because they've seen it on Fortnite. So in a way, this idea of fostering new alliances, and here the alliance was with an ecology project, the Eden project, it was with a natural history museum, and then an art gallery in Kensington Gardens. We need more such new alliances.
Why don't we touch on your final, the last exhibition you did with Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, The Call, because I think this touches on some really important points in terms of what the work was and also how they structured it.
Yeah, I've already talked a little bit about it before in terms of this idea of making, you know, the power clay idea that art can make the invisible visible. And we really wanted to do an exhibition where people could have, so many people ask us, you know, we don't really understand how AI works, how a data set works. So we wanted to work with an artist project which would somehow address that. And in a way, it's really the idea of a collective creation, which Holly and Matt addressed with that. I mean, they are both technologists and artists. You might also know Holly Herndon from, you know, her music practice. She's very well known as a musician. So is Matt, and the idea was to actually create new vocal data sets, to work with choirs all over the UK, and this is now going to tour, so it's going to happen in other countries, and address that in relation to governance frameworks and polyphonic AI models. So basically, the data collection happened, all over the country with these choirs, and the choirs became co-owners of a data trust. So, in that sense, it's not only ethically sourced data, but it's collaborative sort of co-ownership. And the result is an experience of human and machine voices where the audience is sort of entwined with and sometimes even part of the choir. And what is interesting is that, and I think that's where all of a sudden, governments got very interested in this project, which is why, numerous governments are now quoting it and studying it, is that they were interested in AI as a coordination technology. And of course, for many millennia, group singing and call and response as a kind of an associated, technique of group singing has been a ritual for mass communication and has enabled us to build spaces for gathering. And so if we think, that in a sort of an analog world is a coordination technology, and then we think of AI as a digital, coordination technology, it all of a sudden opens up huge kind of possibilities. So the central component, as you can see in the images, are these newly, commissioned called AI models, and then basically the artists. So it wasn't just all given over or handed over to the machines. The artist wrote a songbook of hymns, and this, of course, goes back also centuries, if not millennia. Hildegard von Bingen was in the room with us, from the 11th century. I think it's really fundamentally important right now to revisit Hildegard von Bingen. Almost everything I'm showing is somehow connected to Hildegard von Bingen, because she, as an abbess, in the 11th century, was of course also involved in gardens, in healing gardens, in healing the planet. She was an extraordinary choral, composer. So this project, and some of these hymns were really reminding me of Hildegard, and these 15 ensembles. Then also some of them, appeared live in the space, and so I think it's a possibility how technology or AI and sort of human agency can be more than 1 + 1 is 2.
Absolutely. This brings me on to the sort of subject which is intrinsic to this discussion, which is co-authorship. And Alex, you recently exhibited a new generative art installation called Diffuse Control by digital artist and celebrated NFT creator Mike Winkelmann, otherwise known as Beeple. Can you take us through this work and what it involved?
Yeah, I'd love to bridge what Hans was just talking about into that. Hans talked about ritual and new forms of gathering. And I think what I've been discovering with this intersection of art and AI is that the artists who are, the most successful artists who are exploring this frontier are fundamentally changing the way that we gather around work. And the way we access work. So what do I mean by that? So let's just take the story of Mike Winkelmann, otherwise known as Beeple. So for those of you who don't know him, he's the guy who 3 or 4 years ago sold a composite artwork he made art every day. He made a piece of work every day for, I think, 12 years. And he sold that composite piece as an NFT for $69 million, becoming the 3rd highest selling living artist alive right now, from pretty much obscurity to that notoriety. When I first met him, he told me a story of his coming of age. He would, as I said, make a piece every day, a piece of digital art, generative art, so i.e. art that evolves through time, it's not static, and it used AI. He would as a graphic artist originally, he would try to evolve his career. So he found out who were the 10 men and women, the most important people alive, who he could maybe help him evolve his practice, become better known, gallery representatives, museum leaders. And, like with a lot of young artists, no one wrote back, tragically. He then tried to get into experimental film festivals, no one wrote back. He then started building his own platform, no one went to it. Then he started experimenting, putting his work on other platforms like Instagram. And within a few months, he had several hundred followers, okay? within a year, he had close to 1 million. And after a few years, he had 2 million people following him. He was having a two-way interaction with them. This is not unlike, and it's a very different context, but not unlike a pop star like a Taylor Swift or a Beyonce will have a one-to-one relationship with their audience, okay? Then I find out that his brother, who runs the studio, told me, oh, did you know that Mike has given away more than half of his artworks to his audience? Did you know that he has these events? And I went to one a couple of years ago where he has maybe 1,000 people come to this huge studio, which looks more like a museum than a studio. And there you can see artworks, many of which are by other artists. It's a very generous environment. It's not all about him. It's about the world that he loves and the artists that he loves. Then the afternoon turns into a more celebratory environment with bars, with music, with gaming, with live events. So there's this artist now, rather than being mediated through a gallery or through a museum, at the mercy of whether he is liked or not liked, or she is appreciated or not appreciated. They create their own universe with their own audience, with their own rituals, with their own community. And I think this is fundamentally different to what we're used to, certainly in the visual art world. It's something I grew up with in the pop music world, which I came from. And that was quite advanced, a way of communicating with your audience, especially with the internet becoming more and more used by everyone. So I think this idea of new rituals and new ways of working have been pioneered by a number of these artists, Mike Winkelmann Beeple being one of them. And so the piece that you're asking about, and I'd love Hans to talk about this as well, because he was one of the curators. Mike wanted to make a piece where there was really an ambiguity about authorship. It wasn't all about, the largely lonely white male fighting the world to make these artworks. This was a much newer, much more collaborative way of working. What Mike set up was almost like an engine inside this sculptural artwork that moved, and we might want to show, can we show a piece of it? Why don't we show you the artwork? Okay, so this, if you see it's in, yeah. So this is about 8 feet in height by about 6 feet wide. It's 3 pieces of, yeah, it's a 3-part work. What Mike did was to create a program in it that invites 3 different curators, and we'll just focus on one curator, which is Hans. And the curator selects a number of artworks, and as the audience approaches the work, through their phone, they can zap a QR code, and they can alter the work in different ways, in terms of color, in terms of velocity. There's different dials that you can do. You can then take a snapshot of that artwork. You can either save it on your phone, or you can ask for a print to be made, and at a very inexpensive cost, I think it was $50 or so, get your own artwork that is a collaboration between Mike, yourself, and the curator. And maybe, Hans, you'd like to say what it was like to be a curator in this artwork collaboration.
Yeah, no, it's really exciting because it's always very fascinating when Alex and I speak, because it's ever since we met actually around 2005, it creates these incredible bridges because we, coming from different fields, bring these practitioners together. So, for example, some years ago, actually, there was the opening show at the Shed when we brought together Gerhard Richter and Steve Reich, and previously in Manchester, Gerhard Richter and our Pert, a composer and a visual artist. So when Alex called about this project, as always, nothing more exciting than another new idea of how we could bring fields together. But it really caused me a huge problem, because I just couldn't get my head around it. Because I thought, because curators were invited to select images, which then Mike, and I thought it was a fascinating idea, would somehow put into this AI. But for me, it's kind of unthinkable to do something with an artist without working with the artist, or to work with an artist from the past without, sort of having an authorization. So it goes back to the ethical sourcing of data, right? Which we, in all the projects we are doing, it's the same with Refik, the hundreds of millions or billions of images that were sourced ethically from National Geographic, from the Smithsonian, from different sources, or with Holly and Matt, it even was a co-ownership for data trust. So I was kind of thinking, how could I answer to that? And I don't know, sometimes the kind of most simple answer is like the Edgar Allan Poe letter. The most simple thing is like in front of you, but you don't see it. And all of a sudden thought, I don't have to actually sort of bring in any artworks and so on, but I just should actually invite artists today who work with technology to actually propose a specific answer for this context and choose a work. And so several of the artists we've mentioned today, Holly and Matt, and Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, also Ian Chang, got a phone call from me, so Alex's phone call led me to make a phone call to them, and they then proposed, an image. And particularly fascinating was Ian Chang's answer, because he felt that a lot of this imagery on AI had to do with Yves Tanguy. So he made a whole thing on the surrealist, Yves Tanguy, which then somehow also entered this machine of each, people had proposed.
So a bigger question, if I may. Where does originality now lie? Is it upstream with the artist, or is it downstream with the output? Hans, if you would follow on.
I think it's probably in some of these works, it's both and, instead of either or, instead of no. And I think there is another thing which gets blurred, which I forgot to mention before, which is actually that sort of the distinction between consumption and production gets somehow maybe not dissolved, but blurred. And that goes back to the call of Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, because they basically, did a songbook to be performed so that they could actually collect data to train an AI model, as I explained. And others could then use that to create new music. So when people use the model, the AI model, they are at once consuming the artwork of Holly and Matt, which they created, because the data set is the artwork. They're also consuming all of the performances reflected in its data set, but they're also producing something new. So I think it's interesting that there is this kind of blur between consumption and production. And really a new type of work through that is born.
Do you think then, Alex, we're moving towards an era where we will see more sort of co-authored art, where both system, machine, and artist sort of work together to produce something new?
The birth of opera 400 years ago was a co-authored work. So it's a new way of co-authoring. The thing I'm intrigued by is this, and we touch on it just in the last 5 minutes. We have gone through a period where, particularly in the visual art world, it's quite top-down in terms of relationship with the audience. And here's an opportunity to do something that's more bottom-up. I'm not suggesting for a second that one produces better work than the other. They both will, I think, eventually produce great work and less good work. So it's not a qualitative preference. But I do think that when a new format starts to emerge, like it is emerging right now, as with film, there will be very poor examples of its use, as there was right at the start of film. There's a decade of terrible work, largely. And there will be a lot of less good work, I think. But that's got nothing to do with the format or the mechanic or the grammar, I should say, of the art form, the discipline. That's to do with how whose hands it's in, how imaginative, inventive, and creative they are, and how they get to grips with this new set of tools that really challenge how we think about art. It has largely been a static environment in the visual sense, and now we're in a completely moving, generative, evolving discipline. And I think the more people embrace that, alongside sculpture and painting, they're not mutually exclusive. They're all important. But I think it's a very exciting, and it could be a profoundly meaningful way forward.
If I may, as a follow-on to both of you, are we witnessing an evolution in the role of the artist? Are they moving from just creator to orchestrator, director, engineer? Because in this instance, he designed the sort of the back office of this project.
You should talk about this, but Andy Warhol started this in the 80s with his new form of practice, didn't he?
Yes, and also boundaries, I think, between art and science and technology. I think there is also something there which is changing. And it's kind of interesting because I was interested in these things in the analog way, you know, in the 90s when we began this project called Do It with Boltanski and Lavie. So we started a project. It was kind of an idea we had in a coffee shop in Paris. We thought, you know, we could do an exhibition on instruction art, prompts. It's very pre-AI in a way, you know, because an instruction artwork is a prompt. If you take like Yoko Ono's Grapefruit book, you know, Yoko very early on wrote an entire book of instructions, and then we can do them and realize them and interpret them. Some of these instructions are more, you know, basically prescriptive. Others are very open. I mean, the Fluxus movement, Alison Knowles says make a salad, right? And everybody who makes a salad makes the artwork. There's no wrong way in that sense, you know, to make a salad. That's an open score. But then, you know, Solovich wrote instructions you really have to follow more precisely. So we realized that with the Dewey project that there is instruction art all over the world on all continents. And over the last years, you know, since actually 1993, this show has never stopped. It has happened 169 times on all continents. And the archive keeps growing with local contributions, you know, to that. And then if we think about, you know, the prompt today, you know, in AI, is of course a very important part of, you know, of any kind of artwork created with AI. But even more so than the prompt, it's the protocol. And I wanted to kind of answer your question because Holly, Matt, and I are working at the moment on a research, and it will lead to a project we're soon going to announce to an exhibition project. We're working on a big research on protocol art, and we think it's kind of interesting that in this digital condition, the structures that most profoundly shape our experience are no longer necessarily visible on the surface. So the protocols algorithm, you know, embedded within software are an invisible architecture. And this is an invisible architecture that determines what we see, you know, and these are frameworks which are very much agents of the aesthetic formation. They're crucial in terms of what, you know, what basically happens aesthetically, and they have as big influence, if maybe not bigger influence, than images or texts. They mediate. So in that sense, I think it's very, very interesting to look at protocol art right now and to look at how protocol art, you know, arises almost a little bit everywhere. And of course, it's this protocol art, to come back also to your question, which then collapses the boundaries between art, science, and technology.
Thank you. I'm going to move ahead now. I'd like to draw everyone's attention back to the screen and ask you to listen to Alex. He's going to present a video extract from The Conversation, which is a unique installation he produced with Marina Abramovich and with Hans Ulrich Oberst this summer for South by Southwest. Alex, over to you.
Yeah, no, I had the good fortune of being invited by Ali Munir, who runs the South by Southwest London Festival, which had its inaugural debut last June. And for that, I wanted to put together, I called it the London Lab, and we brought together new work by Mike Winkelmann, who we just spoke about, by Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, who Hans was speaking about. We showed the background to this movement that started in the 80s with Andy Warhol, who really creates the first kind of interactive installation work with video, with sound. And then at the heart of it was this piece where Hans and I wanted to do the first, really the first AI interview for you. And we asked if Marina Abramovich would do this. The format of it was we asked a great studio called Studio Glitch, led by Primavera Filippa, who created an AI of Marina. This was really about the last 10 years of everything she had said, she thought about, and they morphed that into an AI. And the artwork really looked at an interview where Hans and Marina would ask the AI questions, and we filmed Marina's live response. So what you're seeing here is the live reaction of Marina to a question, to her own AI. And maybe we could show...
Avatar answering on her behalf.
Yeah, and you know, in real time.
Amplify your presence, extend your reach, and create new opportunities for connection and transformation. That, I believe, is the challenge and the promise of technology. The key is to use these tools thoughtfully, deliberately, and with a deep respect for the power of the human experience.
Marina, do you agree?
Wow.
Agree?
Wow.
Do you agree?
Wow. Wow. I am speechless. This is unbelievable. I'm not needed there. This is exactly what it's about. It's really. And you know, the avatar will have much more meaning one day I die, because it's really could kept this kind of moment of immortality, you know, that actually human being can't, because we all born and we all going to die. But avatar never die. So that kind of the new aspect is fantastic. I mean, honestly, this is me, my artificial intelligence talking. I think I'm going to use this much more.
Team had a great question, Marina, which is, in the beginning of your career, you know, you were questioned a lot if what you did and what you do was art or not. And it's something, you know, we discussed in our interviews. For many, many years, there was this question, you know, if performance art is art and so on. And today, artists who are using AI technologies are very often facing the same questions. Do you see parallels there?
Yeah, every time is the same, you know. Everything what is new, everybody's against it right away. And then you know, they have to develop, and then some incredible content come from the artist and it's acceptable. And then we move on. It's always the same. It's really incredible. Everything what was every new invention, the society immediately reject and criticize, and then slowly accept. You know, and this is, you know, artists have to be absolutely, you know, used to. I mean, look the past, look Fluxus, Dadaist happening, look sample Impressionist. I mean, the first Impressionist paintings was huge scandal, absolutely the biggest scandal in, you know. And then look at this now, Right to Spring, you know, Stravinsky, huge scandal, and then become the masterpiece. I mean, it's like every time is the same. It's on and on and on. It's always important to look big picture. Big picture then really tells you how history works.
Brilliant. Hans, if I may ask, from the context of your interview projects, do you see value in interviewing AI avatars? What did this make you feel as an installation to participate in?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think it's interesting because it shows us the possibilities that we actually, you know, can really work with our own data sets more than with, you know, other people's data sets. And obviously, this entire project, you know, we didn't just take stuff from interviews Marina had given online, which would somehow infringe copyright, but we basically took only the conversations I did with her. And I mean, Marina and I met on a bullet train in Japan, you know, in the 90s, and since then, over the last 30 years, I've done probably, I don't know, 41 conversations in all kinds of contexts, you know, in hotel bars, in coffee shops, on trains and planes, in, you know, as I do these conversations, I mean, it's a huge data set, my archive. It's about 4,100 hours, you know, so far. And I speak to artists and architects again and again and again and again. And so basically this entire project was based solely on these conversations Marina and I had together. And when Alex invited us, that was very clear from the beginning that we wanted it to be our data set, not other people's data set. So I think there is this huge potential of what we do. We each, you know, all of us have a data set, and how we can actually, and that's something I think which has become much more a focus over the last couple of years. You know, it's not only these gigantic data sets, these infinite data sets which source data from everywhere, but, you know, what are we doing with our own data set? And obviously within this data set, I have conversations with so many artists and architects, and at a certain moment we could imagine that, you know, conversations could become, they could start to talk to each other also through this archive. We could also activate the archives in many, you know, in many different ways. So I think that's why I thought it was exciting.
Thank you. Alex, care to add anything to that?
No, I'm good.
Fair enough. We'll move on.
And also we must say that it's only the beginning, you know, of this journey, because Marina then, she didn't want, because initially we were scanned to become avatars, so that, you know, and that scan exists. But then Marina preferred, which we thought also artistically was like really, really interesting, the sort of ghostly presence of the voice.
Like how?
Yeah, like Hal. And and so basically she loved this idea that, we wouldn't be there as ours, we would be there filmed, as we would through the interview, and you would see us, but then the AI would just be the voice. But we will see what happens. These projects will evolve, and there are actually there was a lot of people got excited about it, and they want to kind of show it again, and I'm sure when we show it again, we will somehow let it evolve.
I mean, one thing Marina did say later in this piece was how she thought AI would profoundly expand her practice. So it's not about replacing it, but it's about expansion and extending her work.
That's super important, I think, because I think it's about expanding the possibilities. It will never replace a live experience we have with a Marina Abramovic performance. I mean, whoever has experienced that, and I'm sure many of you have in many different places, no form of documentation or AI thing will ever replace that in terms of the empathy, the empathy it creates. I've just been to Manchester a few days ago for this, kind of new Gesamtkunstwerk she has created with hundreds of performers. There is just no way this experience could be rendered somehow, digitally. However, it's about expanding, as Alex says, but it's also this aspect she says in the conversation of immortality. And of course, if you think about, how is a performance art practice, traveling over time, once the artist is not there anymore. And that's something Marina reflects a lot upon in the last few years, and will continue to reflect upon in the many years to come, because she is very interested in terms of how it can go beyond the mere documentation. And most performance practices we have, you just have a couple of videos, and it's actually not rendered, very well. And I think in a way she's interested in that, the immortality aspect.
Thank you.
I mean, looking to the future, maybe we could move on to that
Yeah,
question.
we must move forward, because I want to give 5 minutes? 10 minutes, excellent. I want to give some time to the audience for their burning questions. So why don't we, yes, my final question to you, what does the future hold for the Serpentine in the Shed, where AI is concerned?
Well, I had the great fortune of meeting the marine biologist David Gruber about a year ago. And for those of you who don't know David, he is an expert in sperm whales. And a couple of years ago, he put together a team of advanced AI experts, advanced marine biologists, and advanced linguists, because he believes, and he believed then, that there might be ways to communicate with sperm whales. He has been working on this for, actually it's 3 years now, and he phoned me a couple of months ago to say, hey Alex, I think we may have discovered the equivalent of vowels. The vowels of sperm whales, or the equivalent, because obviously the grammar is incredibly different. Think about it though, this is the largest mammal that we know about on this planet. They have the largest brains of any mammal. And David started to tell me also in recent months that he felt that these creatures may be sentient, and that in fact their language, the early signs of their language, could be more advanced and more complex, I should say, more complex than our own. So imagine how that might be made into an exhibition, how we might encounter that world. We don't need to go to Mars, maybe with Elon, and beyond, to see what extraterrestrials might be there. They're actually in the ocean, under our feet. Some questions come to mind. What if humans were not the dominant species on Earth? What if we were given profound wisdom from another species? What if their language is more complex and more elaborate? What if they had knowledge and understanding beyond our own? I was fascinated at that. The idea that we might welcome audiences into a world where they discover some of these questions. There may be ways of creating an interaction between the audience and the sperm whale through a form of communication that's called WHAM, conveniently called WAM. And it's a fascinating world. How would it affect our relationship with the environment? How do we feel about animals? So rather than reading articles and papers telling us what to think, you could actually create an environment where people discover and are allowed to explore these questions. And I think it's only through AI that David has been able to unlock some of this grammar and some of this language. And every time I speak to an artist about this project, they say, how can we help? I think it's a source of endless fascination and curiosity.
Yeah, I agree. I'm extremely fascinated by Gruber, and actually we were in this conversation some months ago with Joan Jonas and him, and I think about this conversation almost every day, because obviously if this happens, then all of a sudden we could have conversations with our pets. And yeah, it's fascinating, and also the way he as a scientist works with artists. I mean, talking about the future, I mean, Martha Rosler once said the future always flies in under the radar. So I think we can't really predict the future. So I'd rather talk about the extreme present.
Sure.
And basically invite you all to come and see our current art and tech show at the Serpentine, which just started actually a few days ago, which is called The Delusion. It's by Danielle Braithwaite-Shirley, a young artist, and she has created a video game and a multiplayer immersive experience, which is very much a show about polarization, about social connection, and it's about bringing people together who otherwise wouldn't meet. And I think we should never forget that technology promised us, and it's something which has definitely not happened, that it will bring us together. And as we know, the idea of social media led to a lot of division. It led to what Eli Pariser calls the filter bubble, that we are somehow more and more locked in a filter bubble, through social media. And I think a lot of artists who engage with technology want to sort of break that filter bubble. They want us to kind of talk again to people we might not agree with. They might want us to be in the same space, or at table, as the architect Lina Gottmey says, at the same table with artists and with actually people, whose opinions we don't share. And that's exactly what this exhibition does. And I think that's what also museums can do. I think museums, if you go to museums, very often people don't talk to each other. I mean, it's silence, right? And very often, maybe people talk to their friends if you go to a museum with a group of people. But you certainly wouldn't necessarily talk to strangers in the museum. That happens too rarely. And I'm very interested in actually doing sort of mixed reality experience like that of, Danielle Braithwaite-Shirley, because it's both a video game, but it's also, in a very sort of performative way, a happening. It's also a very physical interaction, the physical performance. And I think we need to create situations in museums where that can happen, where we create conversations.
Oh, very valuable. Thank you, Hans. We've got a few minutes left. I'd love to turn this over to the audience, to anyone who has a question for either Hans or Alex. They're rarely in the same room together in this part of the world, so take the opportunity. This lady over here in the white shirt. Do we have a microphone? Shall I jump down and give you mine?
I can also yell. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So, I'm the editor of an art magazine, but a lot of what I learned about AI recently is from my 11-year-old daughter. And it interests me that she already, in her evolving, she's a very good writer, she's evolving her own creativity. But a phrase she uses so much is tell it. And I realized recently, she'll make these images, and it all depends on what you tell it. So she'll say, you're not telling it. She'll say, judge me on what I'm telling it to do. That's not good enough. Yes, tell it something different. It. And it is like her partner. So I guess my question is, and maybe you guys aren't qualified to answer this or don't know, but it made me think about how in art schools are artists in art schools now developing alongside AI? Is that part of how you're learning to make art, is with this partner, which is the AI? Do you know how artists in MFA programs are now doing this, essentially? How they're learning to work with AIs in an art school context?
Yeah, it's a very relevant question, particularly also in relation to this whole recent debates about vibe coding, no? And so thank you for the question. I think it's quite similar to museums, that I think actually in many art schools you don't have a tech department, and this is actually Ben Vickers at the beginning was bringing that into schools, and then he brought it to the Serpentine. And I do think that we need, C.P. Snow lamented in the 1950s there is this divide between the arts and the humanities and technology and science on the other side. And I think we've reached a point where it's just very, very important that we have more interdisciplinary, schools. And it's not a coincidence that the most productive schools are the most, in a way, far-reaching schools have been schools like the Black Mountain College, which, really combined all the disciplines. And I mean, I went to speak to Dorothea Rockburn and Susan Weil, two of the great pioneering artists who actually studied there, among the very few surviving artists who were sort of first generation to study there. They're both in their 90s now, late 80s, 90s. And they both told me that one of the most important things was that they could go on walks with some scientists, who were friends of Einstein, and they were very, very seminal scientists at the Black Mountain College, and that does not happen in a lot of art schools right now. So I do think that we need just new models where basically such, and that doesn't necessarily mean, it's not because new technology enters an art school that we don't need old technologies anymore. Rather, on the contrary, that's what I meant with mixed reality, that, there is an increased interest in craft, there is an increased interest in also traditional art forms. So I think we need all of that combined in an art school.
Any other questions? The lady underneath the camera. Last question, I'm afraid.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm Australian. I'm an Australian lawyer, actually, in the creative space. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but recently, in the past 24 hours, there's been a landmark decision in Australia in relation to copyright and creative works. And they've said that companies and people cannot use creative works to mine for AI algorithms, and thus protecting creative works and the works of the creators. And I've been reflecting on that this morning as to whether that is enough to protect creators and to protect their works. But I'd love to get your opinion on whether you think it is enough, or maybe is it going too far? I've seen some commentary of people saying it's going too far. But yeah, I'd love to get your opinion.
Welcome. I was in Sydney last week, and I heard all about this.
Yeah,
that it was about to be voted on, so it went ahead.
Yes.
That's very interesting. There's different reactions around the world, isn't there? Like China is very open. It seems to be very open for progress. America's relatively kind of industry-led, where Europe is being a little more cautious. We're not. I don't think we're experts in this field, but what I can say is that when the bottom fell out of the music-making market, the dominant income for most musicians was recordings, particularly in the pop world, but across jazz and classical. And actually, live was an afterthought. I remember in the 80s and 90s, it was all about the next record. That was where the money was, and that was where you got the largest form of communication with your audience. That, of course, is completely flipped with the advent of streaming. But, and here's the thing, although streaming is still not a perfect force, it has become more refined, more sophisticated in how artists can be paid. Many artists will tell you rightly that they're still not paid enough. But things have improved, and I don't think, I'm sure it's not a binary. I think it's something that I'm sure we're going to learn from what Australia does, and certain aspects of it will be taken on by other countries. I'm sure about that. From the little I learnt about it last week, there seem to be some very good thoughts and practices in there, as long as I think it doesn't become too restrictive.
I think that's such a great answer, Alex. And I think also, in the 90s, one of my first books on archives was called Inter-Archive. So I wrote this book on what can actually happen between people's archives, right? Because there's so many great archives in the art world. So we combined in this book about 100 people who have a wonderful archive and encouraged them to exchange the archive, to make connections between the archive. I think what could also happen, will hopefully happen, is, I've been describing what we did with my small data set with Marina Abramovic, as a project. I think there's going to be so many possibilities that people collaborate with each other's data set, and hopefully there are going to be many new alliances and collaborations, not top-down, but bottom-up.
Hans, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our guests, Hans Ulrich Obrist and Alex Poots.